Anytime you attack a difficult subject in Scripture and try to simply find a practice, find something to do, when you simply try to narrow it down or reduce it and say, well, just tell me what's right and wrong, what's the black and white. The problem is you can choose one of the either and still end up wrong. Because I don't think that with God, things are simply black and white. They're not simply right and wrong. It takes an understanding of God, of His nature, of His kingdom, who He is and what He's doing, to practice anything and be right about it. Right? Let me try to say it a little bit differently. We never start with a practice. You always start with a doctrine. And from the doctrine, you move to a doxology. That's an appropriate response to the doctrine, right? And once you have an appropriate response, the practices come naturally. Today, we're going to look at a very sticky subject, as it was even in the first century. And that's the subject of divorce. But I want you to see that there is a particular way in which Jesus is going to answer the difficult question of divorce. What I really want us to look at very closely is how Jesus approaches the answer and how Matthew lays out that whole subject of divorce and how Jesus responds to it, because I think that's where we're going to get the most benefit. I could simply tell you, as the church has always, that God hates divorce, right? Don't do it. I could send you all out to try to live with your spouses and just not get a divorce. Just tell you, hey, it's off limits, right? And every one of you will struggle with divorce. Every one of you will find yourself in a relationship that at times you're going to want to be out of, but think God doesn't want you out of it, and you'll live in it in the slavery in a way God never intended for you to live in it. So we've got to understand it. We've got to understand the nature of it and what God is really trying to do. Are y'all with me? We're at Matthew 19. Some important things right at the beginning of 19 that really sort of sets the tone for our understanding it in its context. It says at verse number 1, are y'all there? Matthew 19. It says, when Jesus had finished these words, right? Those are the words from the previous chapter on forgiveness. He departed from Galilee and he came into the region of Judea, by the way, which is where Jerusalem is. Beyond, it says, the Jordan. In other words, Jesus begins to move his ministry from the northern area of Galilee, where it had been up to this moment, and he begins to move south towards Jerusalem. And every Bible reader knows what's about to happen down in Jerusalem. So the tension is ratcheted up a level as Jesus moves from Galilee towards where we know he will ultimately be crucified. And in this larger section, what you're going to find is the opposition is going to also intensify the closer he gets to Jerusalem. Are y'all with me? And so as he nears Jerusalem, but not quite there yet, he is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and Jerusalem is on the western side, and he begins on the eastern side of the Jordan River. It says large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. He's healing in Judea in the same way he has healed in Galilee. Everybody with me? And it says, Pharisees came to him, testing him, Matthew says, so that their question is not an earnest question, it's a question to trap him. And they asked Jesus the hot button question of the day. Their question, look carefully at the question. Is it lawful, they ask, for a man to divorce his wife, listen to the words, for any reason at all? Make sure y'all understand his question. They're asking him a question within the bounds of Jewish law. Is it lawful, he says, they say. In other words, what does the Bible say about whether or not a man can divorce? Is it for any reason at all? Because at the time, there was a great discussion afoot about whether a man needed a good reason to divorce his wife, or will any old reason do? And there was considerable debate about it. And what they're asking Jesus is, come down on one side of this cultural argument, please. I think they know very well if he lands on any one side, he's going to alienate the other side. Y'all with me? It would be like asking a Christian, where do you stand? Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Knowing if you give the simple answer, you're going to upset somebody on the other side. Everybody with me? It's the hot button question. But here's what I think is interesting about this passage. The Pharisees and most of Judea are arguing about really a very particular passage of Scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 24. That's where they're really trying to decide. What does that law say about whether or not a man can divorce his wife for any reason? Now, I don't normally do this because, you know, it frustrates people to go from passage to passage, right? But I think we have to turn there to see what's behind their question. Are y'all with me? It's in Deuteronomy chapter 24, and it actually begins at verse number 1. If you will, this is the law regarding marriage. But here's what I want you to see. This happens so often in our culture. I'll tell you right off the bat, and then I'll help you to see it in the passage. What you're going to see is that Jesus is going to argue you're asking the question from the wrong passage. He's going to suggest you're out of context. That's Deuteronomy 24, verse number 1. He's going to suggest you're out of context. All right? Watch this. My Bible actually has the heading, Law of Divorce. Does yours have that heading? That's because your translators are falling into the same trap that the Pharisees did.
Miscellaneous laws.
Miscellaneous laws.
Marriage and divorce laws.
Marriage and divorce laws. Watch this. They're trying to answer the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? That's their question, right? But here's what you've got to decide. Does Moses answer that question in Deuteronomy 24? Everybody with me? Listen to it. This is the law. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, and he puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, right? And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, right? All one sentence, y'all see it? And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, that's the second husband, right? Then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been, he says, defiled. Y'all following? Everybody with me? So if you would ask the question, what is Moses saying with this law? Is the answer whether or not a man can put away his wife for any reason? What's the issue in Deuteronomy 24? Right. The issue is, can the first husband marry this woman twice after she's been married again? And the answer is no. That's what Moses is answering the question. That's his law. Y'all with me? But listen, watch this. They are trying to answer the cultural question of whether or not he can put her away for any reason by haggling over haggling over what constitutes an indecency in her. Are y'all with me? He said, because if she does not find favor, it says, for any indecency. And they're saying, okay, what is an indecency? That's what they're asking. Can an indecency be, as one group says, sexual immorality? Or can an indecency be a bad meal? Now, y'all are laughing, but that's what they said. That was what one group said. They said an indecency can be anything that causes her to lose favor in his sight. Now, here's the question. Does Moses answer that question? Then how do they get the answer to the question? How are they coming to a conclusion about it? Just like we do. We take a passage of scripture and we get out of it what we want to get out of it because the passage does not answer the question. Does Deuteronomy answer the question? Is it lawful for a man to put his wife away for any reason? Does Moses answer the question, what is an indecency? No. He doesn't, does he? He's answering the question, can the first husband remarry his wife if she's been married again? Right? So let's go back to Matthew, now that we've got it. Let's go back to Matthew 19. So that's their question. And listen to how Jesus answers the question, right? That Jesus is not going to go back to Deuteronomy. Jesus is going to go back to Genesis. And here's what you need to see right off the bat. Jesus is not going to answer a divorce question. He's going to answer a marriage question. That's going to be important. In other words, he doesn't go to a divorce passage to answer a divorce question. He goes to a marriage passage to answer a divorce question. Because we want to find out, what can I do to divorce? And Jesus says, the question assumes you don't understand marriage. Are y'all with me? Watch. Jesus is going to go to a marriage passage. Verse 4 says, he answered and said, have you not read? It's interesting, he asked them, haven't you read? Because they've undoubtedly read Deuteronomy. Maybe not well, but undoubtedly Deuteronomy. And his question is, have you not read? And then he's going to quote Genesis. All right? He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? That's Genesis 1:27. Right? And said to them that he made male and female from Genesis. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Right? Where's divorce in the passage? It's not in there, is it? But he's answering a divorce question, isn't he? Watch. He says, so they are no longer two, but one. Y'all hear the answer to the question? They are not two anymore, but one. And then he says, you get this, what God therefore has joined together, let no man separate. Now, we've got to understand this because this is really important. Jesus goes back to Genesis to answer the question, is it okay for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And Jesus says the question assumes you don't understand what God intended for marriage from the beginning. Are you with me? And here's what he says. He says, because God made them both male and female, because they're made that way, it was for that reason that they were made that way that a man would leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. In other words, he made them male and female to be joined together. Y'all with me? And he said, and a man would leave his father and mother for that kind of joining. And it's suggested in the passage, listen, to leave father and mother for a male is a big deal. There's only one good reason to leave father and mother in that culture, and that's to be joined to his wife because they were made male and female. Are y'all with me? That's God's intended design. And by the way, this is just a side note. The way Jesus uses Genesis suggests that the creation of the male and female in Genesis is paradigmatic. Y'all know what I mean by paradigmatic? It means it's the paradigm for all of the rest of male and female relationships. When God created them male and female and said they would be joined together, it suggests that would be the paradigm for humanity. So that Jesus could use the same paradigm to answer a question in the first century. Are y'all with me? It's not simply their story, it's our story. Are y'all with me? Y'all are probably already thinking that can answer some other hot button questions in our culture, couldn't it? But we're not going there because that's not the subject. But watch this. And he says, he says, and the two shall become one flesh. That's when they become joined. Now, most of us miss that because we don't understand. God was serious when he said the two shall become one flesh. In other words, he says they are no longer two people, they're one now. And you don't divide what's one. Now, you can divide what's two, but you can't divide what's one. Y'all get my point here? My point here is, listen, when you understand what God intended for marriage, there's some things you don't do because the answer is obvious. Can you have two sets of friends and become one flesh? It's implied, isn't it? So what is also implied is, if you become one flesh, can you divorce? You can cut yourself in half, right? Well, at minimum, it implies destruction in order to, doesn't it? It implies something violent is about to happen, doesn't it? Sure it does. But listen also what Jesus says, quoting Genesis. He says, so they are no longer two but one, what God therefore has joined together. Y'all hear it? It says what God has joined together. Listen, he can say that in general for all of Israel, what God has joined together, right? Make sure y'all get the significance of that. Because some people, Gilbert, will say, you're not Gilbert, you're Gabriel. I'll keep doing that all the time. Gilbert, Gabriel, right? Some people will say, right, after they're married, well, I married the wrong person, right? God wasn't in it, it was my decision, and I made a bad decision. Right? Well, Genesis says if you get to the altar and say I do, you didn't join yourselves, you have been joined by him. Y'all hear it? It's implied, isn't it? What God has joined together, let no one separate. He's answering the divorce question by getting them to understand what God did when he created the institution of marriage. When God created the institution, it wasn't your idea. It's not your institution. You don't make the rules for his institution. You can have one idea about what you're doing, but God has overlaid his divine sovereignty over his institution, and whether you enter it with the wrong mindset is irrelevant. Are you with me? You can say, like I have some people say, well, you know, I'm not going to lose myself in the marriage. I'm going to remain independent. So some people say, right? Because it's better to be independent, right? I'm going to remain an independent person and become one flesh. Is that possible? But see, the idea of becoming independent again is repugnant to some people, isn't it? Well, you see, you have to help people understand. Well, that's actually a higher calling than independence. Y'all know what it is? Anybody know? It's called interdependence. That's where two independent people decide to depend on each other. That's how you can become one flesh, by the way. So he says, What God therefore has joined together, let no man separate. But listen, that was already written in Genesis, wasn't it? My question is, why didn't the Pharisees go back to Genesis to understand divorce in their culture? Now, I can't answer that question definitively, but I do know they went to a wrong passage to answer the divorce question. So, but here's what's going to happen. Here's how I know they've got Moses in mind, Deuteronomy in mind, and not Genesis. Because they're going to say, why then, verse 7, why then did Moses, listen to his words, command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now, y'all just read Deuteronomy 24, did you? Did you hear a command in there? Where was the command? This is great. D.A. Carson helped me to see a wonderful point about this. I'm sorry, I have to go back to Deuteronomy and show you this. Watch this. Because a bad hermeneutic will always get you a bad answer. Right? Reading into a passage, Ali, will always get you the wrong practice later. Right? D.A. Carson helped me to see this. It says, Deuteronomy 24, it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that he finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and my Bible says, and I'm pretty sure yours does too, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. Says, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. D.A. Carson says the Pharisees read it as that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency. He must write her a certificate of divorcement. That's how they read it. There's no command in that verse. Y'all see it? There's no what he must do. It says, if this happens and this is what he does. Now, if he does those things, then later this is what he cannot do. Y'all with me? But where in it does Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce? In Deuteronomy. He does not, does he? So their hermeneutic is bad. We call that eisegesis, don't we? That's reading a meaning into the passage that's not actually in the passage. So here's what Jesus is going to do. He's going to correct their bad hermeneutic. Watch this. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses, what does he say? Permitted you to divorce your wives. And then he says, going back to Genesis, from the beginning, it has not been this way. Y'all see it? He says, okay, here is how it is in the beginning. Moses then permits this because of your hardness of heart. Are y'all with me? So here's what Jesus has essentially done. He has suggested, I know there is divorce in the community. Y'all with me? I know there's divorce in the community, but the divorce is not because the husband has found some indecency. The divorce is because of your hardness of heart. And Moses is permitting it because of the hardness of your heart. All right? And he says, but that's not how it was from the beginning. He's suggesting, let's not go back to Moses to find out how you can get out. Let's go back to Genesis to find out why you should stay in. He says, y'all asking all the wrong questions. Instead of asking, how can I get out? Ask the question, why should I stay in? Are y'all with me here? That's a much better question. Why should you stay with your spouse? Maybe they're a terrible person. Maybe really it's not working. What's a good reason to stay in? It's an act of God involved here. Do y'all get it? Listen, God put two people together. Did he know one of them was awful? Sure he did. But he joined you together nonetheless. Right? See, when we understand that, it changes your practice. Watch this. When I got married, right, when we got married, we'd had our rehearsal dinner, right? Like most people do, traditional rehearsal dinner. And then all the guys got together, Rachel, to take me out. Traditional, right? Rob's hiding his face. Where then do they take me, Rob? Traditionally. You wouldn't know, right? Anybody know? Jake, you know? Where'd they take me? Huh? Golden Corral, that's right. Good answer. No, Q, they tried to take me to a strip club. These are my Christian friends, right? Because all of them saved, right? That's right, because that's what you do, right? Right? So we pull in the parking lot of this place, somewhere over off of Westheimer, right? We pull in the parking lot of this place, and I say, I ain't going in there. They said, what do you mean? I said, I'm not going in there. I said, man, God is about to join me to somebody. I'm not going to celebrate it by going in there. Listen, I'll be standing before God tomorrow, and he'll be allowing me into his holy institution. I can't go in after having that night before. Y'all, you with me here? And so they said, yeah, we understand. We didn't think you'd go anyway. Let's go bowling. They said it was worth a try, though, Gilbert. But see, that's what we don't get. Oh, you're retested, that's right. Most of the folks don't get this. On your wedding day, you are not saying to your spouse, I promise to do this, this, and this if you'll marry me. That's not what you're doing. Because listen, your spouse is not their institution. It's not their decision to make whether you get joined together. Are you with me here? Listen, in a real way, I've taught people this when they're done marital counseling. In a real way, the preacher will be representing God on that day. And you'll be making some promises to him, and he will decide whether or not he'll join the two of you together. And that's just bigger, isn't it? Because that's really what marriage is. Because listen, it's easy to break your vow to your spouse. It's a lot harder to break it to God. But here's also something that you really got to see. If then you do get a divorce, even if it's for some indecency, the divorce is not because of the indecency. What is the divorce really for? What's the reason? Because somebody's got a hardness of heart. They cannot forgive. He says, you'll be permitted, but make sure you don't go away blaming your spouse if you can't forgive. Because the nature of God is to forgive. And listen, you can't live the rest of your life pointing your finger at them and say, they had an indecency, they cheated, that's the reason we're not together anymore. You got to own it as a believer and say, my heart was hard, I could not forgive. That's what Jesus just said. Y'all hear it? And he says, and I say to you, it would have been okay if he had left it there. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, he says, except for immorality, and marries another woman, he says, commits adultery. Now, here's some things that just happened. He has just reinforced the idea that you should stay together. Let no one separate. Right? In fact, if you separate and try to marry again, you have committed, he says, adultery. Now, how do you commit adultery? Come on, say it. What's the nature of adultery? You're still married. You're still married. Y'all get it? That's having sex outside of your own marriage. So here's what he has just suggested. You can get a divorce, right? And then marry again. And the moment you consummate that marriage, you have committed adultery, because in God's eyes, you're still married. You with me? But he gives an exception, doesn't he? The exception is immorality. Now, that word, hear me, that word is a word that is generally used for a sexual immorality in the New Testament. Now, it doesn't nail it down to simply adultery. It is any sexual immorality. Are y'all with me? And so Jesus does give an exception, right? But here's the question you've got to ask. Do you take the exception when you want out, or do you understand that the exception is permitted you? You're not commanded, you are permitted. You with me? And if you are permitted, why are you permitted to?
Forgiveness.
Hardness of heart, he said, because your heart has become hard. Now, the passage does not end there. The disciples now have got a question. Because here's what Jesus has just done. He has narrowed marriage in their eyesight to one man and one woman, essentially for life. Y'all see it? He's essentially narrowed it. So, in other words, the answer to the question is, for any reason at all? The answer is no. But no with qualifiers, so that you don't simply tell people you're stuck for life. He says, no, understand marriage, and maybe it will work better for you. You with me? So here's what he says. If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, like what? They say, if it's like this, what's the like this? If it's no separating, if there is becoming one flesh and no separating, he says, if it's like this, it's better then not to marry. You know, that's the kind of question that comes from an avid bachelor, doesn't it? And it's better not to get married then, right? Watch Jesus' answer. There's really two ways to take his answer, right? He says, verse 11, to them, not all men can accept this statement or this word, but only those to whom it has been given. Now, there's really two ways to take that. When Jesus says this statement, is he referring to his statement about marriage being binding, or is he referring to the disciples' statement about it's better not to marry? Which one? Now, if he's referring to his statement, right, then when he goes later and says, he who is able to accept this, same this, let him accept it. He would be suggesting, then you can accept what I said if you can, but if not, then don't worry about it. Or if he's referring to the disciples' statement, right, which is it's better not to marry, right, then there's some things in between that will, how do I say this? It will color whether or not it's acceptable to not get married. Are you with me? Watch what he says. He says, verse 12, because this sort of comes out of the blue if it's a reference to his own statement. For there are eunuchs. Everybody know what a eunuch is? A eunuch is a man who has been castrated. He's been castrated, and usually a eunuch guards the king's harem. And so he gets castrated so he can be trusted with the king's harem. He says, for there are eunuchs who were born that way, from their mother's womb. Undoubtedly, he's using eunuch in a metaphorical sense. There's some men who are born able to not need to get married. Y'all with me? And he says, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. That's the literal eunuch. You with me? And he says, and there are also eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. That's, I have decided for the kingdom's sake not to get married and commit myself fully to the work of the kingdom. Are you with me? And then he says, he who is able to accept this, what is the this?
The eunuchs.
Let him accept it. In other words, he says, if you're in one of those three categories, then it's okay. Accept it. Don't get married. But what has he just also said? If you can't be a eunuch, then get married and live inside of God's ordained institution the way he has designed. Did y'all see it? Then get into marriage and leave father and mother and be joined to your wife, become one flesh, and let no one separate what God has put together. There's some thoughts I've got to give you pertaining to all of this. Here's one thought. Marriage is God's design and therefore bigger than any one culture. Can y'all see it? Because listen, what happened in Genesis is a completely different culture than what Jesus was ultimately living in the first century. Yet Jesus can overlay that Genesis paradigm on his culture. So listen, then can I? Sure I can. I can lay it over this culture and suggest to you that when you get married, the two shall become one flesh, and that God will have joined you together. But see, the culture suggests that we get to decide, don't we? Right? I'm the one who decides whether or not I'm joined to one other person. And I can make a bad decision. And because I made a bad decision, I can get out later. They were the wrong person for me. In fact, Gabriel, the church has embraced this idea of being a soulmate. You get it? We think that's true. God has a soulmate for me. Let me tell you who your soulmate is. I can tell you who they are. Y'all know how you find out your soulmate? When you say I do, that's the one. When you say I do, soulmate. You found them. So become one with your soulmate and don't let anyone separate. Are you with me? And here's what's also important, right? If you try to practice any sort of marriage and divorce without an understanding of the doctrine of marriage from Genesis, all it becomes is bondage. Somebody say, well, how's your marriage going? Terrible. We hate each other. Really? Why don't y'all divorce? God said I can't. That's just bondage, people. It's just bondage. Y'all get it? He said no, so I can't. Well, does God really want you to live the rest of your life that unhappy? Now we start to reason. Right? We start to then human reason. Well, God doesn't want me to be that unhappy, right? Because what God wants for me is really what I want for myself, right? And God really wants me to be happy, so undoubtedly he wants me to be able to get out of the marriage. So then we wait for our spouse to mess up. We wait for the indecency to happen. And when it does, we're gone. Missing the paradigm for marriage to begin with. Let me close with this. If you were to study the doctrine of marriage in Genesis, here's what becomes really clear. Why would God join a man and a woman together? Why would he do that?
I believe your image of God.
Now, they have his image, according to Genesis, but why would he join them together? Why does he in Genesis?
Because they are incomplete.
I believe you're better in.
Annalise says they're incomplete, separate. I've heard that before. But here's what the passage actually says. Listen to this. It's in Genesis chapter 1. It says, God created male and female in his image. And then it repeats it. In his image, he created them, male and female. Right? And then the male in his image and the female in his image, he blesses and says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. What's he want the earth filled with? His image. Y'all get it? So that the coming together of man and woman has nothing to do with the fulfillment of the man and the woman. What does it have everything to do with? The fulfillment of God's purpose. Y'all see it? So what's a real good reason to get married? Fulfill kingdom purposes. Now that's terribly unromantic, isn't it, Christy? You know, you don't need wine and roses for that, do you? Terribly unromantic. But here's the problem with it, Christy. Romance don't last. Everybody married say amen. Amen. And listen, if you're in it for the wine and roses, I promise you, Rachel, the wine and roses, they stop, don't they? They do. And if they do, I'm sorry, Rob. And if they do, if you're in it for that, then what reason do you have to stay in it? You don't. But listen, when you have a little boy and a little girl who need to be shaped in the image of God, it takes a man and a woman, doesn't it? Sure it does. Y'all get it? Because it's just bigger than what we are trying to do here. Right? So the idea is that a man who looks like God marries a woman who looks like God, and then they have children who look like themselves, but hopefully they look like, there you go. And listen, what's the good reason then to stay together? You know, we used to say for the sake of the children. That's a good reason. Good enough reason? Sure it is. It's a good enough reason. Because one day, I know my little boy's going to have to get married, right? And hopefully he'll, he said, oh God. And hopefully he'll see the pattern in his father. Right? He'll see the pattern in his father. His father did not leave. Right? And then God will be glorified. And then the earth will be filled with the image of the glory of God. And get this, this is so wonderful the way God is doing things. But then sin enters the picture with the first man and the first woman, doesn't it? Right? And what's interesting, Kenny, after sin entered the picture between the first man and the first woman, then it says, and then after they knew each other and they had another son, right? And that son was in Adam's image. Not in his image, he was in Adam's image. Which suggests what? Sin marred the image of God in the relationship between the man and the woman. But watch this. Then Jesus comes, saves men and women, and then conforms us to his image. And then Hebrews says, and he is the exact image of the Father. So that in salvation, we're getting right back to what God intended from the very beginning, that we would be in the image of God, but now we're in the image of Christ, who is in the image of God, so that two people in the image of Christ can come together and be wed and have children in the image of Christ, who is in the image of God. And the glory of God can be spread throughout the whole earth. See, that's a marriage answer to a divorce question. Divorce in the right context is now an irrelevant question, because what God is doing in marriage is too big for me to simply separate for any reason at all.